The boarding pass had just been scanned when a sharp voice cut through the crowded airport terminal. "Stop! She's not getting on this plane," the pilot commanded, his tone cold and unwavering. The words froze 10-year-old Emily Brooks in place. She gripped the strap of her bag, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes turning toward her. The steady hum of rolling suitcases, distant flight announcements, and hurried conversations seemed to fade as a crushing sense of confusion took over. Emily wasn't just any unaccompanied minor. She was the daughter of Nathan Brooks, the influential owner of Astra Airways. His name carried weight in the world of aviation, but at that moment, none of it mattered. All she felt was the sting of humiliation creeping up her spine. Her neatly polished shoes, her crisp dress, and the first-class ticket she held in her trembling fingers suddenly felt worthless. "The rules are the rules," the pilot said dismissively, barely glancing at her. "Step aside until this gets sorted out." Emily's heart pounded. Her father had always told her to walk with confidence, to never let anyone make her feel small. But when the gate agent averted her gaze, refusing to meet her eyes, a flicker of doubt surfaced. Was she really so powerless? The airport was alive with movement. Families hugging goodbye, hurried footsteps echoing off the tiled floors, the automated voice of the intercom announcing departing flights. Yet, for Emily, the world had shrunk to this moment. Her ticket was meaningless if no one was willing to acknowledge it. Summoning her courage, she stepped forward and faced the gate agent. "Excuse me," she said, forcing strength into her voice. "There must be a mistake. I have a seat on this flight. Can you check my name again?" The woman hesitated, shuffling through the documents in front of her. I can't override the pilot's decision," she murmured, still avoiding eye contact. The response stung. Emily swallowed hard, refusing to let frustration get the best of her. "My father booked this ticket for me," she said, more firmly this time. "I have every right to be on that plane." The silence that followed made her stomach twist. She knew what was happening. It wasn't about rules. It was about someone assuming she didn't belong. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "When the world doubts you, prove them wrong." She reached in her bag and pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed. The moment her father's familiar voice answered, the dam broke. "Dad," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They won't let me on the plane. The pilot says I can't fly alone." There was a pause on the other end. She could almost hear her father's mind working, his patience thin but controlled. "Stay where you are," he said. "I'll take care of this." Emily ended the call and exhaled, trying to steady herself. But relief was short-lived. Passengers continued boarding, casting curious glances in her direction. With every second that passed, the humiliation tightened its grip. She straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to stand tall. Then a voice rang out, cutting through the uneasy tension. "Where is Emily Brooks?" Her breath caught. Turning, she saw her father striding toward her. Nathan Brooks moved with a quiet authority that made people step aside without a word. His tailored suit was immaculate, but it wasn't his wealth that made people take notice. It was the power in his stance, the fire in his gaze. The gate agent paled. "Where's the captain?" Mr. Brooks asked, his voice steady but firm. "He's in the cockpit, sir," the woman stammered. Without waiting for a response, he headed toward the plane. Emily followed at a careful distance, her pulse hammering as they reached the base of the aircraft stairs. The pilot, standing at the entrance, stiffened as he saw who was approaching. "Captain Henderson," her father greeted, his voice polite but ice-cold. "Do you realize what you just did?" The pilot's expression faltered. "Sir, I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Mr. Brooks interrupted. His tone was measured, but the steel in his voice was unmistakable. "You made a decision without checking her ticket, without reason, without respect." The pilot swallowed, looking suddenly unsure of himself. "I was following protocol." "No, you were making an assumption," her father corrected. "One that cost you your position. You will not be flying for Astra Airways again." The weight of those words settled over the pilot like a crushing blow. He tried to argue, but the look in Mr. Brooks's eyes silenced him. Emily stood there, a wave of emotions washing over her. There was relief, yes, but also something deeper, a realization that settled into her bones. This wasn't just about her ticket. It wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about the way people judged without thinking. Back in the terminal, her father knelt beside her, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her throat felt tight. "Why did he do that?" she asked quietly. "Why didn't he believe me?" Her father sighed, his shoulders heavy. "Because sometimes people see only what they expect to see," he said. "But that doesn't define you, Emily. You define yourself." She let those words settle. But as they boarded the plane together, she knew she wouldn't forget this moment. Sitting by the window, she stared out as the runway lights blurred past. She replayed the events, not as a girl who had been wronged, but as someone who had learned something important. This isn't the end of the story, she thought. It's just the beginning. And in that moment, she made a quiet vow. She wouldn't let anyone make her feel small again. Not because of her age, her appearance, or any assumptions they carried. She would stand tall, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. As the days turned into weeks, Emily found herself looking at the world differently. The memory of that day remained fresh, but instead of bitterness, it planted something else inside her: determination. Power wasn't just about money or status. Real power was in using her voice, in standing up, in refusing to let people be dismissed. One evening, she sat on her bedroom balcony, the city lights flickering in the distance. She thought about the girl she had been before that flight, the one who thought her last name alone would shield her. She wasn't that girl anymore. People will try to define you, she thought. But in the end, it's up to you to show them who you are. That night, she made a decision. She wouldn't let what happened fade into the past. She would use it as fuel for herself and for others who weren't given a voice. This was only the beginning. As time passed, Emily often found herself reflecting on that day at the airport, not as a moment of shame, but as a defining lesson. The injustice she had felt in that terminal had ignited something inside her, a fire that refused to be extinguished. At first, she struggled with the weight of it all. Why had the pilot dismissed her so easily? Would he have done the same if she had looked different, or if her father had been standing beside her from the start? These questions lingered, but instead of making her bitter, they pushed her forward. She began to notice things she hadn't before. At school, she saw how some students were ignored while others were heard. In the world around her, she saw how people in power made decisions based on assumptions rather than truth. And she realized that she had a choice. She could let that day remain just a painful memory, or she could turn it into a catalyst for something greater. Emily chose the latter. She started speaking up, not just for herself, but for others who felt unseen. When a younger student was dismissed in class, she made sure their voice was heard. When she noticed a friend being treated unfairly, she stepped in. The strength her father had shown in defending her wasn't just about authority, it was about courage. And courage, she learned, wasn't something you were born with. It was something you decided to embrace, even when it was hard. As the years went by, Emily carried that lesson with her. She pursued opportunities not just for success, but to make a difference. Whether in classrooms, boardrooms, or everyday conversations, she never let anyone else define her worth. And she never forgot how it felt to be overlooked, because that feeling, more than anything, fueled her mission to make sure others didn't have to experience it. One evening, as she stood on the balcony of her home, looking out at the glowing city skyline, she smiled to herself. The girl who had once felt powerless in an airport terminal had grown into someone who refused to be silenced. People will always judge, she thought, but I decide who I am. And in that moment, she knew the flight that almost didn't happen had been the very thing that set her on the path to becoming the person she was meant to be.